Hi all, I'd like to show you a very nice game recently between Levon Aronian and Hikaru Nakamura, but I also want to demonstrate quite a fundamental and important concept which I've had some thoughts of just recently, about weaknesses, creating weaknesses, and this notion of playing solidly. I don't know if you've heard of that, playing solidly. Person X played more solidly. They put up a solid defense. So, and we're sort of encouraged, it's a good idea to provoke weaknesses, and sometimes in the midst of the game you might actually forget, why do you actually want to provoke weaknesses? Let's just examine this question, revisit it, and let's look at some basic ridiculous games in chess. F3 is not usually considered a great move. It actually, depends on the follow-up. You could actually play G3, maneuver your knight here, and often you can actually win with this in blitz chess. I mean, it's like the Fred. You can even move your king. But anyway, the point I want to demonstrate is F3. It does actually create theoretical weaknesses. You see these theoretical weaknesses, these dark square weaknesses. What is it about the weakness, or if we were provoked to move the F pawn, which is actually significant? Let's try and actually express this formally. What is significant about F3? The thing is, after E5 we can get an illustration of what could happen in a disastrous manner if white didn't play G3 but actually used the G pawn and G4. That we see the move Queen H4 and it's checkmate, it's impossible to defend. What is actually happening here is that the weaknesses have kind of encouraged the opponent's pieces into those weaknesses. That's actually, in a way, what's technically happened. So when you provoke weaknesses, statistically, when the opponent, often you get a lot of games lost when the opponent plays F5 because of this diagonal. There's lots of tactics on this diagonal. It's a statistical occurrence, but pieces are kind of invited to this diagonal, and there could be a horrible pin on the king, which is often, when it's castled on the king side, it's at G8. So often actually provoking the F pawn is actually statistically, aside from that very small game idea, that trap, is statistically a frequent way that games are won. So when we think about provoking weaknesses, we may have forgotten that the reason we provoke weaknesses is you're kind of creating an invitation for all your pieces to go into those weaknesses. So a more complex example trap is E5. You could consider that E5 is kind of less solid than E6, because you're kind of potentially weakening or not putting resistance on this diagonal. So you might get this silly game where black might not play the best move here, and we see Queen F7, but white doesn't want to play like this usually because it can be repulsed. But the point is, the theoretical point I just want to sort of highlight here is how weaknesses in general, they virtually invite. It's like sending an invitation for pieces to go into those weaknesses. That's really what I want to echo. So in your own games you might be thinking, well, why should I create these weaknesses? I can't see anything immediately clear cut. I can't see an immediate mate. I can't see an immediate way of winning material. The thing is, you are creating the potential then for other pieces to go into those weaknesses that you've created in your opponent's position. And the same, if you create weaknesses, you're like inviting your opponent's pieces to be into those weaknesses. So the whole notion of playing solidly is not to have these weaknesses, not to have these virtual invitations sent out to the opponent's pieces. That's why it's nice sometimes to play solidly, what they call playing solidly. Now let's look at this game, okay, with this little background question lurking. So Levon Aronian against Nakamura, it was in round 4 of the Zurich Chess Challenge, and let's see what happened. Knight F3 from Levon, the Reti, Knight F6, and we go actually into the King's Indian defense. Now the King's Indian defense isn't as popular at the moment. The raw King's Indian defence isn't as popular as, say, the Slav defence. You could say it's less solid. By g6 there is a weakening of the dark squares already. So think of this idea of weaknesses actually equals invitations. Weaknesses and invitations to opponent pieces. Almost in line, align that concept for a moment. So think about these weaknesses later, how invitations are virtually sent out. Knight c3, bishop g7. Now white fianchettos as well. So white's accepting a certain weakness potential. But, you know, it's often good to have bishops fianchetto. They go across the diagonals. There's upsides. They're a double-edged sword, the fianchetto. So both sides castle, and we get the fianchetto variation of the King's Indian defence. And now black is playing a standard plan to generate some queenside counterplay. h3, rook b8, and this is a very standard method from black. But here, actually, after b5, actually Levon found a slightly obscure move here. Usually in live book, 172 games with e5, 137 with c takes b5, but actually Levon sort of played an innovative move with a good success rate apparently, which was d5. Just for those interested in a little bit of the theory of the King's Indian, e5 could go a bit like this. This is quite a trodden path, so it's stuff to know as black that you might want to play like this, and you've got enough counterplay. Usually it's about equal. Or if we go back to this position, the other move, c takes b, and it could continue a bit like this. There's a lot of games continuing like this, and this should be about equal. This kind of position, black should have enough counterplay. You know, white's got a good position as well. It's about equal. So okay, but we see Levon's move is a bit varying from theory. He plays d5, and I'll put on a kibitzer here. So I just want you to keep that alignment though of the notion of weaknesses and inviting pieces in. I don't know if any of you have thought about this before, but keep those aligned, those two ideas, while we play through this game, because I think it's very interesting. So b4 was played, gaining a bit of space. Knight e2, knight a5, hitting c4. That's protected. Now c6, trying to open up the c file, get some active play on the queen side still. But black has given up the d4 square, and white uses that now with knight fd4. Nakamura takes on d5. And actually we see e takes d5, which means actually in the future the e file could be significant, bearing down on e7. And that is actually a cause of concern that black may want to break out later with e6. And on doing so, imagine an e6 later and an fe. And fe kind of creates a weakness on the 7th rank. Just bear that in mind. That could be an echo of the pressure potentially down the e file, that black might be tempted to in effect weaken the 2nd rank. Something to bear in mind. This idea of weaknesses, inviting pieces like rooks to the 7th rank. Okay, just bear that in mind. Queen c7, b3, securing the c4 pawn, which was attacked. And here, there's no knight d5, the bishop's protecting d5, so no problem at the moment. But now black does decide here to break this bind. What is white actually threatening? Well, white, if left alone, can actually target the a file with a3 and put pressure down the a file and maybe expose the a6 weakness. So black lashes out now with a move which may not be the most solid in inverted commas. The engine suggestion is actually knight d7, but it does, on the other hand, maintain white's bind on the position. And white does seem to be very, very comfortable in this sort of position. You can imagine white is very, very comfortable with black's not going to touch the e-pawn. Then what we have emerging here is a backward e-pawn on a semi-open file. So black actually decided, I mean, to be fair, Nakamura had just had this the day before, a winning position against Magnus Carlsen just the day before. And maybe he was gutted, tired. Anyway, so he played e5. It's not the greatest position to have with black against number 2 in the world, perhaps. It's not the most solid. But let's see. D takes e. It liberates white's bishop now. F takes e. So there's a potential invitation, because you can argue that there's weaknesses here, and the king side's slightly weaker. There's a potential invitation for pieces to try and come into these weaknesses horizontally. I just bear that in mind theoretically. White now plays a3. Black takes. And now the idea wasn't rook takes a3, but a slightly stronger move actually, or maybe a slightly stronger move. At a certain depth actually, Houdini prefers Levon's move here, which is actually bishop d2. Rook takes a3, just the more obvious rook takes a3, is also potentially okay. In fact, here we can even still play bishop d2, and the knight's for the moment still supporting b3. So this position would look unpleasant for black a little bit. It's not too dissimilar from the game. So anyway, in game bishop d2, knight b7 was played, rook takes a3, e5, and the knight did go into that very comfortable looking c6 square, rook a8, and now knight b4 makes sure black can't liberate, with d5. There's an iron lock on d5 at the moment. Black plays a5, and here there's also a pin here, and white uses that fact to play queen a2. So tying down the knight really, the knight's pins, the pawn's pins. Black is tied down quite a lot in this position. White is a little bit better. Bishop f5 was played. Knight d5. Now Nakamura took that. Bishop takes d5 check. King h8. And here you might think, protecting the pawn. How would you protect the pawn? And this is one interesting part actually from our theoretical discussion. That if we played a routine move like g4, which actually engines don't mind, but from a human point of view, you are kind of creating some dark square weaknesses. So it's like a virtual invitation on the dark squares later, if black can ever get onto these dark squares. Like queen e7 to h4 is like an invitation, in effect, that you're sending out to black's pieces. As soon as you create weaknesses, you're sending out these virtual invitations. And actually, an astonishing concept here that h4 wasn't used, because we are sending out invitations for like bishop h3 in those weaknesses. Instead, Levon actually decides to swap his h3 pawn for white's. Sorry, swap his h3 pawn for black's a5 pawn. He actually plays a move not mentioned at all by engines, and that's very, very interesting from a weakness perspective, because computers can play 100 moves in a row with total accuracy. They don't really care if they can't see anything concrete in their depth. They'll play what seems to be weakening pawn moves. But as humans, we have to rely on sometimes intuition and say, one day pieces are going to be invited into these weaknesses. But here, the h3 pawn was actually left. White actually played b4. And even though this wasn't apparently mentioned, it's still a small advantage from an engine perspective, this position, to swap the h3 pawn for the a5 pawn. If I just increase the number of candidates, I'm just wondering, actually b4 does rise to be like the third candidate strongest move. So no weaknesses in a way need to be created, and the advantage of this is apparent because with this pawn here, we're not inviting pieces down this diagonal. We're not inviting pieces down this diagonal. We're not inviting these pieces to be these squares to be occupied. There's hardly any invitation sent. And in fact, after bishop takes h3, you can imagine actually with the king sitting on the h file that later, if the bishop ever moved, then king g2 and rook h1 might actually be useful for white as well to sort of backfire down the h file. But here, okay, we see rook b1, and black is losing that a5 pawn, and white has kind of kept the king side quite solid. We see now bishop f5 hitting the rook, and the rook now goes to b2. So very, very patiently, this pawn is going to be regained. The one that was lost here was going to be regained without creating any committal dark square weaknesses for black. So the counterplay of black and the invitations to black's pieces for exploiting weaknesses have been kept to an absolute minimum. Bishop d7, and now the pawn is taken, restoring material equality. So 4 pawns each, but this is a very significant pawn. It's a very dangerous outside pass pawn, And there's a nasty domination by this bishop at the moment, which is challenged with bishop c6. White now reinforces control of d5 with knight c3, and white has a marked advantage here. Black plays knight c5 now, and we see now bishop e3. So in advance of any attack on f2 now, actually everything's nicely supporting f2. So even if black swapped off the bishop and slipped in queen f7, there's no double attack or anything. f2 is not such a problem here. Black now plays e4. And you could say this is not a solid move. It creates some weaknesses potentially down this diagonal. Is it actually virtually inviting pieces later, white's pieces, to use that diagonal? Bear that in mind, because black's already also lost the f-pawn, which although gives black some dynamic f-file potential, also weaken the second rank. So these are theoretical invitations in the future which become possible for the opponent's pieces. So this diagonal and this rank. We see a6 extending the danger of the passed pawn. Now knight d3 is seemingly a very aggressive move, but the a pawn is kind of celebrated very, very well in this position with a very strong move actually. White played the remarkable rook b7. I think also rook b1 maintains white in a strong position, but rook b7 is very interesting. If bishop takes, a takes, black is not really going to be able to pick up that pawn very easily, and white's now going to be taking that pawn if it's not defended here. But white could actually take on c5 and take here with a very nice position. Black doesn't have too much pressure on f2. It's not such a big deal this position. White has still good control over the position with a rock solid pawn on b7, and with rook a8, black is probably on a downhill path there. So anyway, rook b7, that was ignored with queen c8, as though, okay, is there some light square weaknesses to try and get into or use? But what about the e pawn? This is taken. Now black plays bishop takes d5, c takes. Now the queen comes in aggressively to g4, but there's a loose knight here. Although the queen is attacking e4, white can take now the knight on d3, queen takes e4, and the rook now switches rook db3. So the outcome of all this is white is a pawn up. But what about the d5 pawn? Why was the d5 pawn left, you might wonder. Let's see. The rook was attacked and d5. If rook d1, it doesn't seem as though black has anything that convincing, to be honest. Bishop e5 might threaten bishop g3 for queen e3, but I think this can be parried technically with a move like queen e2. But anyway, white just decided to give up d5 here with rook db3. Very interesting decision indeed. So why was this? Well, the rooks are supporting each other now. Queen takes d5 was played, and we're equal on pawns. And black might actually be threatening now queen d1 with some sort of perpetual check. If king h2, queen h5, if king g2, queen f3. So white covers now d1. And the remarkable thing is, having strangely given up the pawn, what was the purpose to this madness? The purpose, I believe, is just to speed up the effectiveness of celebrating this passed pawn to play a7 and rook b8 with both rooks, doubled up here to support rook b8. This is the whole thing, that white was prepared to go back to exact material equality for this passed pawn. Nakamura now is in a very, very difficult position. Believe it or not, this position is so critical. The engines think it's approaching +5. This position, +5, believe it or not. It's actually equal on material, but it's +5. One of the factors is not just this pawn here, that black's blockading his own pawn. This pawn is mega dangerous, but there's also, the invitation has been responded to on the 7th rank already. That's a nasty attacking piece going across the 7th rank. Statistically, a lot of games are being won recently at Super Grandmaster level and Grandmaster level, just with a rook glaring down the 7th rank, just supports combinatory blows. So Queen C6 was played, which does unblock the pawn. And now, in this position, there was a very strong move which the engines cry out for, but there's two moves, which the more simple one is A7, justifying previous play, and Rook B8. And we're about to see the other one exposed now, more evidently here. So White is now threatening all sorts of things, including Rook B8, but also another latent threat. But Rook B8 is very, very serious, because White can just then take and then Rook B8, and it's big trouble for Black's king. Here we see Nakamura at now approaching -7. It's +7 for White, this position. So it's not just because this next move might be suspect or whatever. This is a lost position technically for Black. Even though it's equal on material, it's completely lost. But after D5 you see that some of the echoes of previous pawn play are really punished explicitly for Black's king safety. In terms of Rook B8, this might be what D5 tried to do something about it, but even here this is difficult for Rook B8. You know, Queen C7 we can just take on A8. Queen B5, it's just an incredibly seriously difficult position. I don't think it really matters about D4 because of Queen B8. And then we can just take on A8. This would be crushing. Then play Rook B8. So even this idea is winning. But there's another solution in this position, which was played instead. If I give you 10 seconds, can you spot it? So 10 seconds starting from now. You might want to pause the video. Okay, Black's king safety is actually very weak here, incredibly weak, and made weaker after Rook takes G7. This diagonal, which we said theoretically, you know, was inviting pieces in, is actually that bishop's given itself a major invitation by knocking out Black's fianchettoed bishop. After King takes G7, Bishop D4, there's another invitation in the background here on the 7th rank. If Black played to this check Rook F6, then we've got the crushing Queen E7 check just picking up an entire rook, and there's no counter check in this position for Black of any significance. It's actually a forced mate in 5 here. So there's not too many choices actually, because King G8, Queen E7, and then what does Black do? If Rook F7, we just play Rook B8 check. Black is overloaded here. Totally overloaded. So it's really a bad position to be in. The king ventured out, and this is not good news. We see Queen E3 check, and Nakamura I think was just a good sport to play this on. If he plays G5 here, we've got an invitation virtually on this row. So Rook B6 is pretty good, I think. That's winning, but technically also G4 is also very strong, threatening Queen H3 and Queen H5 mating. So that's very difficult to parry as well. But we see actually King H5 being a good sport. G4 check, it's just a forced mating sequence now. After check, Queen H3 check. Kings don't usually survive when coming out like this. And now Black resigned. If King G5, then check and Queen G4 is mate. If King E4, then Queen G4 is mating after this. So anyway, I thought this game was a kind of illustration of what can happen when weaknesses are created, but it's a much more complicated game than that as well, because of the A pawn was a big distraction for Black and overload. It was actually A pawn by itself winning in many variations. But you can see how I hope that I wanted to also introduce this idea, this connection, this immediate intuitive connection that we can make, that when we provoke weaknesses, we're kind of creating, you know, our virtual invitations for our pieces into the opponent's position. If the opponent creates weaknesses, it's like they're sending, those weaknesses are sending out invitations. I hope you found something interesting in this. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.